Welcome. Welcome to episode 15 of Reading to Mom. My name is Joe, the publisher at Historia Research near Printers Row in Chicago, Illinois. Well, what do you know? A narrative twist in the last chapter. Instead of a missing merchant, Sidra is now on an epic quest for a lost talisman. Perhaps if the author were to smelt this talisman and forge it into a ring in a volcanic fire that could destroy the ring, we might actually have an epic fantasy worthy of telling. Derivative, yes, but nonetheless enjoyable. Alas, what we have is an author reading to his mom. Hi, Mom. Let me first say, happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Sidra's story continues with the revelation that the merchant was abducted in order to determine the location and find an ancient artifact, a preternatural artifact of great power that would allow this wanderer to command arcanists and commoners alike. Now, a person like my publisher would think that this artifact should be the centerpiece of the entire story, and some struggle to either regain control or destroy the talisman would make some sort of high fantasy that everyone could enjoy. I, on the other hand, put my faith in young scholars who will have more interest in understanding how our arcane ancestors came to possess fantastic abilities as represented by the classical powers. Therefore, while the first half of the chapter does follow Sidra's narrative and her actions along the lineman in the latter years of the Arcane Age, we take time to consider which faculty, friend, allowed arcane peoples to master the four elements and marshal them into fantastic powers. At the risk of being pedantic, to say the least, I felt that it was beneficial to our young readers to emphasize how care and self-improvement was at the heart of the Arcane Age, rather than a shiny object that had to be destroyed in a molten fire. Chapter 14, To Prepare Stout Freen. Sidra tended to the merchant while the others searched the ruins for the remains and equipment of the devoured mercenaries.
The bounty proved to be plentiful, despite an unspoken understanding among the Soom to turn a blind eye to Eosh's pillage, in gratitude for her heroics at the start and end of the battle with the Omkra.
Aside from the coin and salvageable gear, the search turned up nothing directly incriminating the dynasty's Orsun Tekanax for their treachery.
In the consumed druid satchel, Tigris found a scroll with a glyph representing a preternatural age temple, but with no other markings or illustrations to indicate the location or pathway to the temple.
The merchant, to their good fortune, possessed precious information the Soom desperately needed.
Sufron, as he introduced himself, confirmed the 5 arcanists who stole him from his caravan met with a grisly fate in the days before, when 3 scrawny Omkra, berserk with starvation, assailed the hideaway.
He indicated that during his month-long ordeal, his captors spoke as if they worked for the dynasties and guildmaster of the clerics. He readily accused the two for having concocted a scheme to kidnap and remove him from the Acropolis. They despised my success and coveted my profits, he claimed.
Sufran knew nothing, however, of the conspiracy to seize control of the citadel with the aid of the Lyman cultures. When the mercenaries first took him, the merchant explained, they were keenly interested in his knowledge of where he had uncovered the loads of artifacts in the region.
Among the merchants of the Acropolis, Sufran sat atop the pyramid. He was the first of the merchants in the territory to discover a great cache of preternatural age artifacts. The magical weapons forged during the long conflict of the civil wars that gave way to the glorious revolution and the advent of the Provenance often exceeded the craftsmanship of Sidra's contemporaries despite the recovery of the old cities and classical powers over the course of a millennium and more. In the years prior to arrival at the alignment, the number and quality of the artifacts of the time of the glorious revolution suddenly flowed from the region all the way to the towers of Panoptes. The arcanists of Provenance, flushed with a fascination for more powerful wares than they could procure from the eastern mechanic artists, demanded more and more of the precious arms, armor, and accoutrements. The trade of artifacts proved to be so lucrative that scores of philosophers, merchants, mechanic artists, and other ne'er-do-wells rushed to the Acropolis in hopes of making a quick fortune off the discovery of a preternatural cache. After they finished with me, the merchant put it, the mercenaries planned to seek a powerful lost artifact known as Arcane, or the Commander.
At that moment, Tigris interrupted, as Katidios chattered in agreement on his shoulder. His work at the Acropolis entailed the translation of several scrolls, which the wizards of Agrigentum attributed to a preternatural arcanist who wrote using a cipher of the former godhead's ministry in Tidios.
Evidently, Tigris had made little progress with the scrolls, but one combination of signs occurred frequently. When read as syllabigrams, footnote 1. A syllabary is a system of writing in which the signs represent common syllables in words, a syllabigram being one such sign in the system. Sequoia's Cherokee syllabary is perhaps the most well-known from recent history, but many ancient languages, such as Linear B for Mycenaean Greek, used syllabic writing systems. End footnote. When read as syllabigrams, the symbols reference an object called Archon. In each case, he indicated to Sidra the text closely associated object with the last known ruler of Tityos, Archelaus. Tigris spoke these words. Very little is known to the wizards of Agrigentum today, and translations of the few remaining writings remain imprecise. Archelaus rose to power over Tityos soon after the defeat of the sorcerer in the east. Some of my brethren think that Archelaus was the same sorcerer Tityos by a different name. Others that he was yet another noble despot whose classical powers vastly exceeded the surviving arcanists of the territory. Record suggests Archelaus was long-lived and ruled over the territory surrounding Tityos for an epochal prime. At the end of his rule, the peoples under his despotism rose up to defeat their oppressor and destroy Tityos.
He admitted that he paid little attention to the reference at the time, for it seemed to him nothing more than a thyrsus, or ceremonial scepter, to symbolize the rule of Archelaus over the people of Tityos. The thought that the Archon somehow empowered the ruler to enslave Tityos like the godheads never occurred to Tigris. The connections were circumstantial, but clear. The dynasties and guildmaster hired the mercenaries to kidnap the merchant under the premise that the most successful trader of artifacts from the Lyman knew the location of the artifact, Archon. The mercenaries sought the artifact on behalf of the dynasties, who believed the instrument would grant him the power to rule over the Acropolis like a godhead.
With the merchant's testimony and the growing opposition to the governance of the dynasties among the Acropolitan nobles, Sidra believed she had discovered the answers her Soon needed. But the merchant refused to cooperate. Sufran feared the dynasties and rejected the presumption a handful of philosophers with dubious provenantial authority would be able to protect the merchant if he made known the accusation of kidnapping. He had no doubt that the dynasties gave the order or his approval for the merchant's abduction, but to speak out in the public space of the Acropolis and accuse the governor of such a crime without evidence needlessly imperiled his life. I will not be the thread to unravel, Sufran objected, when the dynasties wishes to put an end to your suspicions. Despite Sidra's solicitations, the merchant would not budge. Footnote 2. Eosh offered to garrote the coward, but not even the threat of immediate death from the lineman convinced Sufran to reconsider. Eosh, no friend of the Provenance, even cursed the merchant for his cowardice. The best of all possible worlds is naught but the mound of dung you accumulate by chance. End footnote. Despite Sidra's solicitations, the merchant would not budge. 2 mornings following the confrontation with the Omkra, after the spellcasters renewed their wisdom and the battlemasters healed, the Soom headed back for the Acropolis. Aside from the constant badgering of the merchant, which twice almost resulted in a summary judgment by Eosh, the week-long return to the Acropolis progressed uneventfully.
The merchant continued to resist all manner of passionate and reasoned argument to stand up in defense of provenantial democracy against these would-be tyrants of the Acropolis. Lacking evidence for a conspiracy to usurp the rule of law at the Citadel, Mysoon found itself forced to return under cover of the night, according to the arrangements with Oron.
It dawned on the covert arcanists as well. They may not take credit for the return of the merchant because the claim would expose their surreptitious transgression into the lineman. As planned, they returned in secrecy, as if never having left. They allowed Oron to take credit for the return of Sufran and present him to the dynasties. The merchant agreed in advance to implicate an Orga clan as his captors. Sufran informed the dynasties he fled after the Orga suffered some tragedy that engulfed their small community in flames. In the confusion, Sufran escaped his cell and made his way back to your enemy, carefully moving at the height of day. Footnote 3. Perhaps seeing a chance to have her authority reinstated, Sidra insisted on the embellishment that attributed the merchant's escape in good health to the conflagration she visited upon the Orga clan. End footnote.
At daybreak the next morning, I left the inn to confer with Themis before he opened his practice to the masses that were collecting in the merchant quarters. Eosh waited outside the doors of my hostel and greeted me. The rogue had a sudden and peculiar interest in the matter and volunteered to accompany me.
When the two arrived, Themis welcomed them into his shelter. Sidra recounted the events leading to the discovery of the missing merchant, his evidence against the dynasties and his consort, concluding with Sufran's subsequent refusal to openly accuse the leader of sedition. Themis listened to the story without interruption. When Sidra ended, he rose to his feet, paced the floor for a time, and then turned to his guests to offer his ideas. He cast no blame on the merchant for his pusillanimity. Inside these walls, the dynasties is nearly unassailable. His magistrate and bailiff will not jeopardize their offices unless presented with substantial evidence of his wrongdoing. Eosh groused, still contemptuous of the traitor, but conceded, 2 eyes are better witnesses than 4 ears. The return of the merchant and the loss of the mercenaries changed the means, but not the ends, of the Soom. The seizure of the merchant exposed a series of events likely holding more than an episodic relationship to each other. Themis enumerated the discoveries the search for the merchant turned up. First, the cultures of the lineman have established a level of intercourse that was heretofore unknown to the Acropolis. Second, a wanderer seems to be the catalyst for the inchoate allegiances forming among the cultures of the lineman. Third, this wanderer convinces the lineman tribes that the Provenance marshals its forces against them. Fourth, the dynasties and the guildmaster kidnap the merchant in order to force him into revealing the location of his cache of artifacts. Lastly, the artifact that the dynasty seeks reputedly confers on the one who wields it the power to command armies of arcanists and commoners. It seemed clear to Sidra, in any case, that the Archon and the identity of the Wanderer now must be the primary objectives of the Soom. Sidra wrote,
The missing merchant was merely a symptom of more pernicious designs in the lineman. The Archon, and the Wanderer who wishes to use its power to unite the cultures of the lineman against the Providence, must be exposed.
Themis added that he once heard rumors of a marvelous artifact similar to the one described. At the time, he dismissed the legend as an apocryphal story of absolute power. The nobility told each other to keep alive the fire of hope for an eventual return to gentility. He rummaged through a stack of scrolls tied and cataloged in his makeshift shelves. After several minutes passed, he whistled breathlessly in relief when he found his notes. Themis called Sidra and Eosh to him, relating a conversation he once shared with a noblewoman in Agrinio. He would have dismissed the exchange entirely, he said, if not for the verse the noblewoman recited. A verse. The Logos of the Primes will anon utter the name of one who shall return esteem for nobles among commoners who too long lack regard for their social betters. All shall kneel and wonder and revere mighty Arcane, disinterred from the temple of commandments. End verse. The reference to a temple immediately reminded Sidra of the map discovered with the druid's belongings among the gear recovered from the Oncra's victims. Sidra removed it from her pack and unrolled it on Themis's desk. A single glyph with the appearance of a temple in one of the quadrants of the map was all that the parchment revealed. Without orientation or other landmarks to juxtapose the position of the temple, the single mark gave no indication of the whereabouts of the Archon. Themis and Sidra fussed over the empty map for nearly a half hour, looking for some hidden text or a chant to unlock the secret markings that would reveal the location of the temple.
As frustration got the better of me, I looked up to challenge the rogue for assistance with the map. Surely, in your travels in the Lyman, you must know common tricks of cryptology.
My dear Sidra, Eosh responded, you bark like a dog who spies a person it does not know. Only then Sidra noticed Eosh sitting smugly in the comfort of Themis's chair, waiting for her moment to come out of the shadows and explain why she insisted on accompanying the cleric that morning. Eosh stood and approached the parchment. In her hand she grasped a small pouch filled with dust. Surely you knew chance did not bring me to your inn this fine morning, she said, and tossed a handful of dust onto the map. Sidra's journal entry fully captures the curiosities of a fantastic age, long past.
I first thought to challenge the thief for breaking the knave's agreement. I suspected Eosh stole the dust while the rest of us turned our backs in appreciation of her valor against the Omkra. She repaid our gratitude by stealing evidence that frustrated the purpose of the Soom. When I moved to confront her, I startled as the map reacted to the magical dust. The scroll began to flutter violently before spinning so quickly that a single mark on the map appeared, as if it was a carefully drawn circle. I stared intently, as if the formation of a circle from a single point, by the simple fact of motion, carried some special meaning. Then the map came to a quick stop, and, to my astonishment, the dust settled to form a raised relief map on the scroll. The dust formed into a topographical chart of the Orpheon Mountains that revealed the position of your enemy in relation to the temple. To each side of the parchment, images of the 4 dragons indicated the directions in which the chromatic dragon rises and sets. At the top and bottom of the parchment, the dust aligned into a fine script that spelled out a message to any who learned the secret of the scroll. Arcanists beware. Take heed to prevent freeing from deceptions born by careless wonder or desire. Evidence from the senses soundly teaches conviction for wise acts, while wretchedness fells philosophers who fail to mold stout freeing to face the archon of love and hate.
Footnote 4. Friend, or freen in the plural, is a word that engenders wonder among modern scholars. No word is more bound up with the life and meaning of the Arcane Age. The word had many and various meanings, including midriff, diaphragm, mind, heart, taste, and will. At times, such as in the gem verse here, it means all of these at once. The classicist S.M.D. Venulis wrote extensively on the meaning of friend from the few extant fragments of the past, the arcane past. See in particular the notion of friend in the works of Agrigentum and Scotanus, a PhD dissertation held by the Weathermark Center for Rumination on the Classical Powers from 937 of the Golden Age. End footnote. Illustration 9. Logograms of the Archon. The Archon, while one object, was composed of 2 distinct items. The first, a stone in the shape of an eye. The second, a thyrsus, or what we would call a ceremonial scepter. Each of the distinct items had their own logogram. However, neither logogram ever appears separate from the other. Both together signified the power of the Archon. Eosh quickly touched the artificial spires of Uranus formed on the map, and the magical dust suddenly collapsed into an amorphous mound at the center of the parchment. Themis and Sidra burst out in objection at the rogue's interference in their investigation. The rogue ignored the two clerics and collected the dust back into her pouch. Don't think for a second I will allow you two the time to commit this map to memory. If you wish to advance your recriminations against the dynasties, you will need my assistance on the next leg of your journey. Perhaps sensing Sidra's suspicions, Eosh cut off all debate. The pouch of dust is mine, and you do not know from whence it came into my possession.
I cursed the rogue, hiding behind her beguiling smile. I protested the rogue's demand and insinuated she had ulterior motives for seeking the Archon. But Eosh would not be dissuaded from her terms.
Themis interceded to calm Sidra, mentioning his favor for Eosh as an integral part of Assume to seek the Archon. Eventually, Sidra ceased to fulminate and agreed that a rogue, with or without the dust, must accompany the party who ventured to a temple built by a powerful philosopher from Tityos during the first epoch of the Arcane Age.
We devised a plan for the Sum to seek the temple and recover the Archon before the Dynasties or Sumtekenax was able to reclaim the artifact. Eosh refused to divulge exactly when she came upon the magical dust, so Themis and I presumed the co-conspirators learned the location of the temple from the mercenaries who had kidnapped the merchant, Sufron.
At Eosh's insistence, Sidra selected Matna as her champion. Sidra pretended to object, but in truth she had not yet forgiven herself for the atrocities she perpetrated against the Orga community at Aj's urging. They added Rajana to the Sum to take advantage of her ability for flight, as well as the enhancement and protection that her Zephyr extracts afforded Arcanists. Tigris' knowledge and scholarship on the era around the time of the Glorious Revolution made him a natural choice for the mission. Sidra nevertheless objected to the exclusion of her most trusted companion from the group, Kivan, despite the possession of a relief map that rendered tracking skills less valuable to the Sum. Eosh scoffed at the rationale to include a ranger over a wizard. Themis also favored the selection of Tigris over Kivan, so they then tagged Tigris as the fifth and final member of the adventuring Sum. The members of the Sum chosen.
I determined my Sum must obey the warning written on the map by the magic dust. Prepare stout Freen before venturing to the temple that houses the Archon. Over the objections of Themis, who regarded time of the essence, I decided my Sum should remain in the Acropolis for one cycle of the moon, in order to ready ourselves for whatever powerful foes or obstacles defended a preternatural age artifact, secured for several epochal primes in a lost shrine.
Sidra herself noted in her journal she had not honed her classical powers since her stay in Agrinio months before.
I have not availed myself of the many memories of phenomena I had received during my labors in the Lyman.
She then recounted several lines from her master's teachings.
The philosopher who will be a healer must not be guided by plausible theory, but by the combination of practice and reason. Intuition is nothing more than a composite memory imprinted from sense perception by a forgotten event. Only phantasms of sense deliver details to the friend, which stores them up as remembrances. The first principle of the classical powers, then, is to draw conclusions from the great variety of actual phenomena presented by sense perceptions. For when care originates in material evidence, it then partakes in the classical power of friend to commingle with the source of sense perceptions. Working together, the cosmic friend and the four elements endow the healer with the arcane wisdom of the first and most lofty classical power.
To the untrained eye, today the inscription on the map and Sidra's musings about the cosmology behind the practice of the classical powers are abstruse and incomprehensible verses. As emphasized many times in these pages, the culture of the arcane peoples appears as if from another plane. devoid of reason and saturated by symbolic totems and talismans. Footnote 5. The earliest professional historians of the Arcane Age regarded the arcane world as rational and translatable into the language of the modern world. In a sense, they believed reason transcends the context of culture and history, flattening world history into a single comprehensible narrative. A second camp of arcane scholarship contested the simple formula that suggested modern historians must only get into the mind of arcane peoples. It is pure folly, they argued, for modern historians to seek an authentic understanding of the arcane culture. Our worlds are incommensurable, not subject to translation, and all such work is a projection of modern anxieties or idealism onto the political and social history of the Arcane Age. More recently, a third camp of revisionist historians argue for a complementary approach that acknowledges the fantastic distance between the modern and arcane cultures, yet which does not reduce the Arcane Age to pre-modern savagery and shamanism. See Pim and Rune, Historiography of the Arcane Wisdoms, pages 397 to 401. End footnote. As emphasized many times in these pages, the culture of the arcane peoples appears as if from another plane, devoid of reason and saturated by symbolic totems and talismans. Our modern world, desirous for ends and unmindful of means, teaches us one's time is better spent at religious worship or in economic ambition, rather than liberal contemplation of fragmentary texts and esoteric events. For the arcane peoples, nothing could be further from the truth. Their whole way of life, its means and its practices, was inextricably bound up with reflections on the origin and practice of the classical powers. During the age, arcane philosophy, the love of arcane wisdom, was a way of life, not an avocation or diversion. It is unsurprising, then, that people so mindful of understanding the nature of the powers created by the commingling of four cosmic elements possessed a word to describe how such simple and feeble creatures, born in slavery to the Godheads, came to exercise such force. Friend. Friend translates into modern languages as no one word or concept. The plasticity of its usage in the Arcane Age renders its translation by far the most complicated and contested aspect of arcane scholarship. In fact, the variety of its meanings stems from the multiplicity of the classical powers. For rogues and bards, the friend of their classical powers related to the concept of taste and the midriff, as the sight of hunger, which closely relates to modern ideas about desire, subjectivity, and gratification. In the words of Scotanus, rogues who love wisdom should taste a great many pleasures. Footnote 6. The literal translation of the fragment reads, rogue philosophers acquaint their friend with primal pleasures. I have translated the line to capture the modern meaning of the aphorism. End footnote. For rogues and bards, the friend of their classical powers related to the concept of taste and the midriff, as the sight of hunger, which closely relates to modern ideas about desire, subjectivity, and gratification. In the words of Scotanus, rogues who love wisdom should taste a great many pleasures. In Sidra's excerpt, one finds the connection of the clerical friend with intellection and the remembrances. The emphasis on drawing conclusions illustrates the common notion among clerics and druids. Their friend exercise power in the logic of classification and analysis. For barbarians and sorcerers, friend most closely aligned with distemper. Footnote 7. Distemper translates as anger in the case of barbarians, and mood in the case of sorcerers. End footnote. For barbarians and sorcerers, friend most closely aligned with distemper in the heart, stirring the four elements into powerful agents of passions. Do not obliterate the place of the torch, the sorcerers counseled in defense of the passions against reason. Fighters and rangers frequently use the term friend in reference to will and diaphragm, for these classical powers valued calculated, purposeful intention to guide the combination of the four elements. Chalcedon, an Anthropodan master of the combat arts, claimed, Justice is simply the advantage seized by the stronger friend, or will. These four examples of the classical powers illustrate the robustness and meaningfulness of friend to the Arcane Age philosophers. Nonetheless, the most treasured wisdoms of the arcane peoples have been irrevocably lost to the modern world. Although largely subject matter for the fanciful imagination of professional and amateur scholars, enough ink has been spilled in examination of arcane cosmology to warrant further consideration before proceeding with our narrative. To truly grasp the significance for Sidra and Hurston, as well as her hesitancy to pursue the Archon after reading the warning in the gemverse on the map, the reader will benefit by the recent advances in modern erudition in the subfield of arcane cosmology. The earliest reference to Freen is found in Agrigentum's seminal work On Nature. Only 6 fragments with the term friend remain from her work. As in the various translations noted above, friend carried several meanings in her text. Foremost, friend referred to the corporeal site or organ, head, heart, diaphragm, etc., in which the control of the 4 elements originated. The section of her work explaining how Anthropodons called upon the 4 elements of nature, much of which regrettably did not survive the Arcane Age, begins with the line,
Freen are the sublime seat of arcane wisdom.
Agrigentum's system, unsurprisingly, was therefore the first to name friend as the organ endowing our ancestors with the unique ability to control the 4 elements at a distance. She also deployed the term friend to define the incorporeal psychic faculty or cognitive process, intellection, mind, will, etc., representing the unification or commingling of the 4 elements into particular manifestations of the classical powers. In this respect, Freen were not only sites within the body, but specific ways in which our Freen articulated our intentions with the 4 elements of the cosmos. Agrigentum asserted,
Steadfast friend contemplates the 4 elements with serious learnedness and faultless care, to receive wisdom that strengthens its power, to reach out and to rejoin with its own kind.
It was not enough to have a friend, it should be noted. Agrigentum clearly thought all arcane peoples, regardless of their arcane abilities, possessed Freen. Friend strengthened and reached arcane wisdom only through careful study and interaction with sense memories of the 4 elements, its own kind. For this reason, Agrigentum advised philosophers to engage the senses in a manner dangerously similar to the disciples of Scotanus.
Heed, my apprentices, with all your senses. Discern how the elements manifest things, trusting no more to eyesight than to hearing, no more hearing than to taste, taste than to smell. Freen tend to the outer world impartially, reject none of the body's means to make sense, attend any path to the arcane wisdoms.
Footnote 10. In the final 3 lines, I have translated Frontides as tend in this rendering and repeated the imperatives without reference to the pronoun you, as in you reject, you attend, in order to remain true to Agrigentum's hendecameter. End footnote. Agrigentum, as discussed at length earlier, mistakenly identified the classical powers with the faculty of reason alone. Her system failed to predict the discovery of 2 classes for every dyad of the 4 elements, based on the faculties for both reason and passions. Consequently, the few remaining fragments of her thought suggest that friend and his power closely related to the mind and intellection. The penetrating insights of Scotanus, in contrast, often exemplified the passionate comprehension of friend and the classical powers. Scotanus never put words to parchment, so the surreptitious arcane philosophy of the rogues passed from generation to generation in oral traditions recorded by non-rogues. As Eos's predilection for chiding Sidra demonstrates, the rogues often revealed the teachings of the obscure master to win an argument with the reasoned classes. Over time, the arcane philosophers of the age came to know many pithy aphorisms attributed to the most cherished philosopher of the rogues. One anonymous admirer collected the sayings into a single work attributed to Scotanus under the title On Nature, an unsubtle riposte to Agrigentum. Many millennia later, the thoughts and system of Scotanus reach us as luxuriant, if confounding, statements on the nature of the arcane world and its classical powers. To grasp the meaning of Scotanus, it's first necessary to understand the rejection of Agrigentum's intellectualized characterization of Phren and his power to control the four elements. None of the aphorisms sums up her disdain for mind and intellection more so than the refutation, as the following verse came to be known. A verse. Contemplation does not teach arcane wisdom. Otherwise, it would have taught Agrigentum and Colophon. Footnote 11. Colophon, the preternatural age druid who discovered the power of mushroom spores to induce shape-shifting. End footnote. A verse. Contemplation does not teach arcane wisdom. Otherwise it would have taught Agrigentum and Colophon, the godheads and the lowly nobles. Footnote 12. The verse illustrates Scotanus' penchant for unusual meters, true to the arcane use of prime numbers, but with a maddening and unpredictable meter like the 11-7-17 syllabic meter in these lines. Here as well, one sees the use of the 11-meter line when the rogue master opposes outright the direct teachings of Agrigentum and her followers. In this chapter, the fragments from Scotanus' On Nature adhere to the poetic translation of rank shrift in First Arcane Philosophers, pages 37 to 47. End footnote. Instead of contemplation, Scotanus counseled the peoples of the Domain to place their arcane aspirations in the passions. According to the roguish master, reason only found purpose in passionate engagement. We are not rational. There is intelligence solely in what impassions us. Footnote 13. 2- and 4-syllable meters are also a frequent transgression of Scotanus and her followers. Here, the 2-4-2-4-2-7 stanza invokes thoughts of hesitancy as if the rogue steps carefully through the shadows until poised to strike unexpectedly with a flourish. End footnote. Passion has a specific mode of expression in the teachings of Scotanus. Desire. The way of the rogue was to covet, to obtain, to enjoy. Consequently, Phren came to be identified with the midriff and hunger in an abstract sense. A verse. Freeing gained power with each exchange of desire for satiation. End verse. Satiation, according to Scotanus, not contemplation, increased the power of the passionate desires of rogues. Footnote 14. Paradoxically, many rogues sought to augment their powers between adventures by pursuing symbolic ascetic rituals to deny themselves immediate gratification. Even in these moments, when roguery seems to be a contemplative philosophy, the rogues preferred to taunt the classical powers of clerics and wizards. Such bouts of asceticism they explained with the axiom, "Every beast is driven to pasture by a blow." End footnote. Satiation, according to Scotanus, not contemplation, increased the power of the passionate desire of rogues. More than any other aspect of the rogue's character, this impetuous indulgence of the basest desires perplexed the reasonable philosophers of the Provenance. Nonetheless, the arcane wisdom of the rogues was the first and most integrated in the passionate philosophies, in part, perhaps, because the arcane peoples never rejected desire outright. Footnote 15. The necromancer, Elia, ridiculed rogues and all others who regarded the passion of desire as the first principle of the cosmos. Cosmos, or being, desires nothing, for if it needed anything at all, it would need everything. In refutation of Scotanus and the rogue's moving universe, the necrologists argued that the cosmos was whole and immovable. Thus, the necromancers dismissed the movement of passions, joy as well as sorrow, as mortal illusions to conceal immortal life. From Elia, the way of undead. On nature, fragment 7, from Paline, in the 4th epoch, 7th period of the Arcane Age, as translated by Manfrey, Ancilla to the Arcane Philosophers, pages 41 to 47. End footnote. Nonetheless, the arcane wisdom of the rogues was the first and most integrated of the passionate philosophies, in part, perhaps, because the arcane peoples and provenantial peoples never rejected desire outright. Only a few misguided philosophers proposed to extinguish all passions in pursuit of reason. More so, the people of the age recognized the torment and allure of desire, as Scotanus well knew. A verse. The rogue with raving tongue utters naked, grotesque words to transcend the limits of epochal primes with her voice and pass on the seductive desire within her. End verse. Most arcanists came to recognize the need for moderation between reason and passions. Even Agrigentum's error was not total. While she did not attribute passions with the power to marshal the 4 elements, she surmised the universe shares in equal parts passions and reason.
2 cosmic forces, passions and reason, are in the past and will e'er be in the future. Boundless logos, never empty of the two. The anthropod body too manifests the universal contest between the couplets.
Agrigentum's error arose from the assertion that the 2 forces of nature worked separately from each other. Passions united the elements, while reason divided them, one gaining the upper hand only to give way to the other, a cosmic dance in which the many formed one and the one formed many. As she wrote,
in one logos, passions bring the elements together to form a unified order. In the next logos, reason's force disperses, the elements repelled in all directions.
Early in the Arcane Age, however, a very different sensibility took hold. At first, the roguish arcanists articulated a different vision of Friend's faculty to mobilize the 4 elements into classical powers. In their system, Friend exercised passions and reason together, not separately or in turns. This meant the psycho-cosmic work of Friend conjointly brought the force of passions and reason to bear on the elements. The fantastic phenomena of the classical powers burst through the horizon of events under the guidance of both. Scotanus once again professed a succinct explanation of the complementarity of passions and reason. The road up, reason, and the road down, passions, are one and the same. End verse. As the cunning aspect of the passionate philosopher's assertion, the new formula did not simply replace reason with passions as the primary force of the cosmic order. Instead, a ceaseless flux of passions and reason, unifying and dispersing the 4 elements in purposeful yet temporal combinations, became the paradigm of arcane metaphysics. What's more, one of the most confounding aphorisms of Scotanus plays on the duality of the Friend's faculty for unification and dispersion. A verse. Friend is the vaporization out of which everything else is composed. Moreover, it is the least corporeal of things, and is in ceaseless flux. For the moving world can only be known by what else is in motion. Footnote 16. In this verse, vaporization represents the force of reason to disperse combinations of the 4 elements into an amorphous collection of elemental bits. At the same time, such a dispersal results in the least corporeal, or least finite of things, and which posits a vast unification in the most basic harmony. In a final deconstruction, nonetheless, the passage suggests that dispersal and unification are secondary. Constant motion, what is actually sensible to the humanoid mind, is even more primal and the basis for our species' knowledge of the physical world we belong to. End footnote. Although the rogues and their masters may have been the first to utter such sentiments in the councils, the westward expansion of the Provenance introduced many more passionate philosophies and arcanists, who generally shared a high regard for passions as the partner of reason. Thus, in conjunction with the concept of friend, the arcane philosophers possessed a second word to express the conjoined force of passions and reason: Frontides, or care. Perhaps no axiom was more widely quoted during the Arcane Age than the one that translates as, "Arcane wisdom begins with care." Footnote 17. The similarity to the Middle Age philosopher who claimed wisdom begins in wonder is notable. The difference in meaning is vast. The latter was the product of a man born and raised in a slaveholding society who argued that those who suffered the indignity of enslavement were made so by nature, not by the slavers. Thus, like the presumed difference between enslavers and enslaved, wonder places the object of wonder at a great distance, as well as endows the object with terrifying characteristics that provoke fear and trembling. Only the few, the slavers, were capable of a wisdom born of wonder. By the time our noble ancestors coined such an aphorism, the democratic sensibilities and the pathos of the Arcane Age, care, had long ceased to exist. End footnote. Care, or Frontides, exemplified the joint application of passions and reason to amplify the primal elements of the cosmos. First, as reason, the object of care is alienated and analyzed. The one who reasoned took care to maintain the distance between object and subject. At the same time, the passions maintained an attachment to the object. The one who cares holds dear that which belongs, in some way, to the subject. Thus, care represented the paradoxical forces of passions and reason, as the basic human faculties to manipulate the four elements of the cosmos into the classical powers of the arcane philosophers. A verse. Effortlessly, everything is set in motion by the care of freeing. End verse. Footnote 18. See Frontides in Colgin's vocabulary for a thorough treatment of the potential meanings of care in the arcane languages. End footnote. Effortlessly, everything is set in motion by the care of freeing. Our modern sensibility, so laden with the duality of mind versus body, our intuitions versus deductions, lacks a basic sympathy for the struggle and search for meaningful action by the arcane friend. Nothing came easy to Anthropoid freeing. There were no unmediated recognitions of metaphysical ideas or substances to penetrate the humanoid mind. There were no simplistic rules of syllogistic logic to move freeing from supposition to conclusion, like the dismal logic of exogenous preferences. Quite the opposite, in fact. Freeing felt the way through reason to wisdom. Joy, anguish, courage, defeat, anger, pain, pleasure, arousal, pity, envy, alienation, possession, all of these freeing feel. Footnote 19. From Vanulus, Friend, page 179. Freeing felt the way through reason to wisdom. Joy, anguish, courage, defeat, anger, pain, pleasure, arousal, pity, envy, alienation, possession. All of these freeing feel. Haltingly, disturbingly, the arcane peoples sought direct knowledge of the four elements to empower themselves and unlock the secrets of the treasured philosophies. Above all else, though, the arcanists needed to practice care for themselves, to harden their friend, to secure and strengthen their own unique apportionment of the four elements and the cosmic friend. On this last point, modern scholars often and mistakenly identify the hardened friend of our ancestors as a sphere located somewhere in the chest region. Hardening freeing or molding stout freeing was akin to achieving the equilibrium of a sphere. While it is true that arcane philosophers represented the cosmic friend as a sphere, the analogy intended to evoke the concept of perfection. Agrigentum first imagined the universe, its cosmic friend, as a sphere.
Equal on all sides, wholly unlimited, the cosmic harmony of the elements rejoices in its spherical solitude.
The first arcane philosopher to record the wisdom of necromancy, Elia, likewise draws on the concept of the sphere to represent perfection, not simply circularity. A verse. The cosmos is complete on every side, like the mass of the impeccably round sphere, equally proportioned in all directions, from the center to its vast outer limits. End verse. In both passages, Fren is deliberately characterized by the idea of perfectibility, not purely sphericity. The care of the Fren for its own allotment of the four elements contained by the body, and the sense memories the elements constantly formed, nurtured arcane philosophers' apprehension of the classical powers. Sentiment for the unlimited potential of the Fren gave rise to the personal self-reflection and continuous improvement that marked the age, and the popular image today of arcanists endlessly engaged in efforts to enhance their abilities, acquire more powers, and increase their endurance in combat. Footnote 20. In this respect, Fren is closely related to the concept of the perfection of man, recorded in many revolutionary writings that animate democratic societies. Soon after each democratic revolution in world history, it seems, revolutionary peoples embraced the ideal that a democratic civilization is capable of perfection, and that progress will be measured in the fulfillment of that ideal as the public good. Peoples of the Golden Age, both more cynical and more self-loathing, so far removed from the revolutionary ethos of our ancestors, often lose sight and hope for the twin blessings of democracy and perfectibility. End footnote. Sentiment for the unlimited potential of the Fren gave rise to the personal self-reflection and continuous improvement that marked the age, and the popular image today of arcanists endlessly engaged in efforts to enhance their abilities, acquire more powers, and increase their endurance in combat. The Enchanted Map's command to mold stout Freen reflected devotion to the study of the classical powers that permeated the cultures of the Arcane Age. In a sense, it was an unnecessary warning, but also an adage that was never recalled too often. A simple statement to remind the arcanists to hold dear the arcane wisdoms and the precious yet delicate liberty of the Provenance they protected. Little wonder, then, Sidra and her Soon dedicated a cycle of the moon to the study of their arcane wisdoms and to harden their Freen before seeking the Archon. And this concludes Chapter 14 of Arcane Cage.